So I'm really pleased to welcome Jeremy Porteus here from Housing Lynn, and you have gallantly said that you're going to absolutely canter through, and in classic cheesy chair style, I'm going to share what you were suggesting, that it was Cheltenham Races Week, so you were going to canter and gallop. Yes, that's the level of humour we've been cooking up this morning, I tell you folks. Welcome, Jeremy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Des. And my colleagues, John, Linda and Atta will probably come and join me shortly. What you may not know is that I play football for England in the over-50s five-a-side World Cup. This is a presentation in two halves, another little joke. And so we're going to give you very much around the co-production and involving local communities in determining and looking at the types of lives and homes that they want to live in. So you're going to hear a little bit about Witton Lodge, a really innovative scheme that's been in the making for many years, but it's a really powerful presentation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeremy Porteus. I'm the Director of a Housing Learning Improvement Network. We were formerly part of the Department of Health, and I had great pleasure at that time working closely with RiPfA on some of the really early thinking around integrated care and the work that Peter Thistlethwaite and others did to help inform the Department of Health's programme around things like the Health and Social Care Act and more recently the Care Act and the like. I worked for Richard Humphreys and David Bean in particular on housing, and one of the things about that integration piece, especially around horizontal integrations, where did housing fit in terms of that local piece in relation to local communities? And I'm going to draw on that in a concept that I've developed called, in partnership with John, around collaborage. It's around how we look at an ageing society and collaborative forms of co-production, and it builds on the sort of resilient models It builds on the resilient models we've already heard about. But what many of you will not know is that I was very much inspired to look at issues around social work when I did a degree in social policy in Brighton and spent some time in the General Hospital with a health social worker, NHS social worker, where I'm afraid I got distracted from going on to do my CQSW because I looked at the housing and homelessness issues faced by a lot of people who are looking at alcohol recovery as a result of some either short stay or long-term support and patient-inpatient care at Brighton General Hospital. And then for some of you who've been in social work for some time may know the inspirational social worker Sandra Jacobs, who's one of my mentors when I was at Barnet Council running homelessness services. So I've got slightly distracted from an adult social care perspective, but it's always been very much at the heart of what I believe and think. The slide here just shows one report I just draw your attention to on the left. It's called HAPPY. HAPPY stands for Housing Our Ageing Population Panel for Innovation. It's a piece of work that both I commissioned when I was at the Department of Health, but have subsequently written a couple of further reports for the all-party group on housing and care for older people, chaired by Lord Best, which looks at the housing contribution to creating the type of asset-based communities and types of resilient models that we've already heard about this morning. And if you haven't come across the Housing Lynn, we are a free-to-use network of professionals working across housing, health and social care, and we're probably one of the sort of organisations that is sort of hardly known about, but we have 40,000 people who subscribe to our newsletter. I've got about 10 minutes or so, as I said, to canter through this. Can anybody tell me what this is? Yes, it swings. Thank you very much. It's a bus stop. It's an approach that has been developed in Ontario and Toronto to look at how to create more age-friendly communities and to think about green space around our public transport and highways, around the sort of places where older people congregate and communicate. And it's around trying to create those bumping spaces to think about the types of connectivity. And the gentleman at the back talked about the types of relationships that are built, both in terms of neighbours, but also with strangers, and in addressing issues around local community activism, or indeed just general places to have very meaningful conversations. And I think this issue about age friendliness it comes through the core of what a number of people are thinking about within a housing context, both in the way we design our specific homes, whether it's purpose-built extra care housing or more mainstream housing. And many of you will know that there's a housing white paper that sets very ambitious targets that are unlikely to be met, but we'll be looking at the types of qualitative aspects as well around the housing design, as well as the types of communities that we want to live in the future, so that not just the current generation of older people, but the cohort in this room will live with safety, security, and better access and adaptable types of settings where we can accommodate our older age. Some of this is being captured in a report also by Lord Filkin and the Ready for Ageing Alliance, which talked about how we were woefully underprepared as a society to think specifically about our housing. It's estimated we have a shortfall of just under 250,000 a suitable accommodation for older people. If you were to add adapted accommodation for people with physical and other forms of disabilities, such as sensory mental health impairments, we probably have about 750,000 short of the type of real suitable accommodation that can enable us to live in that sort of preventative sort of thing, that accommodation that Alison talked about in terms of the types of ways that we can support in relation to early intervention and prevention, or support, facilitate some sort of transfer of care to people in their own home and manage some of the risks and empower them, as we heard from one of the questioners earlier. This was then followed up last year by another report from that group, which said we're still not ready for ageing. And this also talked about how we needed to think about the type of housing not only that we want to build, but also the type of housing we already have and what people's experiences are in terms of living in them. For many of you, you'll be no surprise to know that we have a large number of accommodations in England that is unfit for human habitation, coupled with about 20% of people over 50 actually have no housing asset at all, and are not going to be the downsizer or the person who can afford to purchase the type of lifestyle choices that you read in the Daily Mail, Sunday magazines, or whatever it might be. So again, we need to think about the types of homes and communities, as well as the type of support and the critical importance of your roles in terms of both understanding the assessing the needs, but also those welfare and broader well-being objectives in terms of the future housing provision. And getting that message across is really important. And there's growing movements of things like collaborative homes, co-housing, co-ops have been around for some years. But how can we instill some of those principles in an asset-based approach within a housing and community setting? And it's very much not about, as I said, the bricks and mortar, as important as they are, but also the connectivity and the relationships that people have, both intergenerationally, but also within communities of older people themselves, whether it's a purpose-built scheme or indeed residential care. So we need to think about that whole equation. And as I said, integration is not just about the health and social care integration. We also need to think about housing and other services as well. And a very interesting quote from our trade magazine, which is called Inside Housing, last year, which says the shortage of purpose-built housing for older people is actually bed-blocking the housing market. We actually have a number of people who are under-occupying, in effect, their family homes. But there isn't a realistic or affordable choice for those people to move and free up for younger families to move into and create new hearts of local communities. So we need to think about that, both in terms of our housing, but also the way we plan. So again, your planning colleagues in local government have a very critical role to play. And that's an area that the Housing White Paper that was published earlier this month is trying to address as part of its measures. As I said, there's a number of really important resources out there and think tanks and thought leadership taking place. The All-Party Parliamentary Group is a very useful avenue and conduit for thinking about how we can become, within a housing setting, more care-ready. We've heard issues already around things like the Care Act, the NHS vanguards. Housing has a critical role to play in terms of the types of at-home care and support services, both in managing some of the transitions we heard from Lynn and Alison, but also how we create the capacity of people to take greater control over their own lives, whether it's indeed through those personal budgets, but in fact most older people who are not in the system are very effective self-funders and self-carers as well. So we need to think how we can help facilitate them and also support the environments to enable them to maintain and sustain that. As David Bean talked about, the compression of dependency models that are out there as well. If you're interested in housing, the white paper is out for consultation, but the DCLG Select Committee has an inquiry, and the deadline for that is next Friday. So if you have any contribution to make, please do go onto the Parliament website. The points that we will be making very loudly is that the government's very much talking about smarter homes, how we construct and procure our accommodation for a starter family, not looking at last-time movers who are people in later life who want to make a more realistic housing choice. So what does this mean? Well, we need to look at more collaborative forms of housing. And this slide, and you have it in your pack, thinks about the types of engaging, to think about whether extra care, better use of sheltered housing, looking at existing residential and nursing care provision for both people who want to make those lifestyle choices or indeed people with complex needs, long-term conditions such as dementia, to think about the types of home-based services. And social workers will be, many of you will be working very closely with housing officers who are struggling at the same time to deal with some of the resource allocation issues that they face in terms of managing their rents and service charges. You won't be aware, but the welfare reforms for things like rent collection, most local housing associations are probably going to have to reduce their rents over the next 20 or 30, 2 or 3 years, which will have issues around the viability of some of those, the minus 1% rent cut for those of you who know the technical aspects, coupled with welfare reform that many of your clients will also be faced with. The impact of the local housing allowance and universal credit for older people, I think, will have serious implications on maintaining both mainstream housing and out of London and the South East specialist housing as well. So again, we're very much engaged with government to try and look at what the particular measures might be for older people to co-create some of the types of solutions in terms of managing, self-managing, as well as getting the types of added support, that little bit of help that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation used to call, to develop more community-led approaches. And we're seeing that develop, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. I'm not going to dwell on the integration piece. We've heard a little bit about that already, and I've talked about the links with the unfitness for ageing. But I wanted to come on to a few slides that really capture what I mean by collaborative forms of housing for an ageing population and what I've termed, as I said, the collaborage approach. The first is an architect at the School of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, an octogenarian who 30 years ago built his own home, built to something called the Circadian principles. He was he's passionate about Mozart, Wagner, and very good Highland classical music. But one of the things he noticed in terms of his friendship groups was about the stability of the local communities, where his social networks and the relationships he was building around that, and how the environment and the home for him was critical for maintaining that, both in terms of his own self-esteem, but also his connection and feelings of longing and belonging to the community. And he started thinking about the psychology of ageing in terms of his own well-being, but also about him and the biology that we heard about earlier. And he talked about how, he wanted to think about his home in terms of combating the loneliness and isolation. Some of the things that Lynn talked about, and Alison talked about actually in her presentation, that link with things like public health. But what he looked at in terms of the Circadian principles, in terms of how he could co-create and co-design the home, in his particular instance, to live in balance with things like nature. So in terms, looking at the passive solar gain, in terms of the lighting, how it looked at south-facing, how he used green space, the garden, how he could look at adapting that in later life, and in particular how he could get greater control over the accommodation. And those are sort of very simple measures that are now sort of rolling out in some of our building management and housing management techniques. And just linking that into the resilient models, we're seeing within a housing setting how we're looking at three aspects of resilience. One is very much around building that personal resilience that we heard about, the individual asset, the social capital, but also the community, as well as coming back to that age-friendly approach, that lifelong neighbourhood, the age-friendly, the community. And again, those are really important, and housing are really trying to grapple with this in terms of how somewhere like a Healthy New Town or the new sort of garden villages need to develop 20 to 30,000 new properties in some of the communities I'm sure you live in. I know there's some people from Swindon, so some of the schemes that are happening on the outskirts of Swindon is a very good example. So this got us thinking, John, about the sort of collaborative sort of forms and the collaborage approach. And very simply, there are 5 core principles. Thank you. I'm sorry, my eyesight seems to be easier to read it from here than down there. And very much sort of picking up on that sort of the models that Alison have reflected. But what we looked at was some of those in the forms of that greater involvement. Yes, we wanted to see more independence. We wanted to ensure that that was much more inclusive housing, both in its design, but also its position within neighbourhoods. It was better integrated with health and adult social care and wider sort of health agenda issues. But the key thing for many of us was around how to create much more inviting communities to meet that sort of principles that Dean was talking about in the longing and belonging, so we can enable sort of have a feel-good factor at any stage of the life course. And so taking that forward, we sort of developed the happy design principles. These are now not mandatory, but are very much good practice. We're building the evidence. We're working with the National Institute for Health Research on a number of research projects across the country. In fact, PSSRU are one of them with Bristol on the ECHO project, extra care housing for operators. And using the Ascot modelling tool, the adult social outcomes tool, we're already seeing some of the marked improvements in terms of the individual well-being of residents moving in to those types of neighbourhoods. And this is a slide of a particular scheme in Dorset, Trailway Court. It's a case study on the Housing Lynn website. Oh, I do keep on forgetting this. So there we are. That's the radar chart. So just coming to a conclusion, the asset-based approach, is it a monopoly, game of monopoly? You know, is it a community chest, or do we do it by chance? Well, bearing in mind what somebody talked about, the sort of the lack of training and awareness, often it does appear by chance. But what you're going to hear about in a minute is about how actually it is a community chest, how communities themselves are starting to look at these and explore these as part of their approaches to ABCD. It is preventative in reducing more costly care. It creates better cohesion, and actually it helps regenerate in many areas for both people. It's both people with an asset base, but also people who feel disenfranchised in terms of their local community. But finally, this is a particular slide I really enjoy. We also need to tackle some of the ageist approaches. So whenever we go past a residential care home, we see the sign on the left. But actually, when we go past an extra care or an age-friendly community, we should be using the sign on the right. So that's all for me for now, and I'm really pleased to invite John, Linda and Afzal up to give you a real example of how this is working on the ground. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. My only criticism is that you said, if you're interested in housing, oh, I can do this for you, John, take part in the conversation, but we all need to be interested in housing. I think very, very clearly it's a neglected issue.